Hello, hello. Excellent. This is our first episode of a project that I've been wanting to do for a while, where I have an interview series with an expert in a specific field of debate, and that field of debate is NFA LD. And our expert is Chad Meadows, the director of debate from Western Kentucky University, a powerhouse in the speech and debate community. And so, thank you very much, Chad, for agreeing to do this.
I'm really excited to be here, Jared, and to let more folks know about NFA LD.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so we're going to get started. I think anyone who's watching this is, maybe you're already participating in tournaments. Maybe you're thinking about doing it, and so we thought we'd start off with the most logical starting, which is understanding what this event is, where it came from, and sort of the landscape of like the national circuit or regional circuits and things like that. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So I guess NFA, let's start with that because NFA LD is kind of a two-parter. So
Yeah.
tell me about the National Forensics Association.
Yeah, so the National Forensics Association hosts a big national tournament at the end of the season, and they are also a qualifying institution for college speech and debate tournaments. So they host 11 speech events, and then one debate event, LD. So the name NFA LD is kind of used to represent that this is college Lincoln-Douglas debate that is sponsored by the National Forensic Association. And they're also the organization that establishes the topic for NFA LD, and they also establish the rules for the event. So if you were a high school student, like this is the NSDA of Lincoln Douglas debate, if you will.
But there's a difference between high school LD and college and this type of LD, right?
Yeah, definitely.
What would you say?
Okay, so whenever I first try to explain NFLD to people, I basically say, try to imagine that you have the speech times of high school LD with one exception, which is that the second affirmative speech isn't 4 minutes like it is in high school, it's 6 minutes. And then, second, imagine that instead of the topic changing every 2 months, it was one topic for the entire season. So, in terms of the way that it works, it's kind of like a hybrid of the topic rotation structure of policy debate with
Right.
one topic for the entire season. And that topic tends to be a resolution that tests the desirability or the benefits and drawbacks of action by the United States federal government. But we're putting it into the times of Lincoln-Douglas debate, which is a little bit closer to 45 minutes
Okay.
to an hour, as opposed to the longer hour and a half to 2 hours of a policy debate round.
Now, is it just called LD just because it's one-on-one? Is that the whole
Yeah,
Lincoln
so
Douglas? Yeah.
Lincoln-Douglas debate refers back to a series of debates that Abraham Lincoln had with Stephen Douglas. Pretty positive it's Stephen Douglas.
Yeah.
Last name was definitely Douglas.
No, people mistake it with Frederick Douglas all the time. Like I
Yeah.
think I've done it several times, and
Yeah.
it's like some historical. Yeah, but no,
Mhm.
he was not debating Frederick Douglas on. Yeah.
So Lincoln was the president of the United States. Douglas was the president of the Confederacy, and they were debating slavery, state rights, the issues that were obviously incredibly important in those days. Actually, I think at the time Douglas wasn't the president.
No, I
of
believe
the
it was
Confederacy
they were going
yet.
for Illinois State Senate,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Is
yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so high school debate, I believe, when they created high school Lincoln Douglas debate quite a bit earlier than college adopted Lincoln Douglas
Oh, really?
debate, they just took the same name. So it's the same name from high school debate. It just refers to the debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
The high school debates tend to be a little bit more like the value focused, right? I mean, am I right about that? The
Yes,
topic,
yes.
like
So
not there are more topics, like there's a bigger turnaround, but the wording of them themselves are not around a policy action.
Exactly. So in high school, and this is definitely changing and dependent on the circuit you're on, but generally what we call traditional Lincoln-Douglas debate. So the way it was kind of originally like envisioned,
Mhm.
the affirmative and negative both have a value that they argue is sort of like the end point, the end goal of the resolution, and then some sort of criteria, a way by which we can measure that. And they kind of assess if the affirmative and negative, in a general sense, is able to achieve their criterion and ultimately their value. And there's a lot more emphasis placed on traditional and formal philosophy. So their resolutions oftentimes involve issues that may have to do with moral dilemmas and moral quandaries, or the ethics that are involved with the decisions that we as political agents make. NFA LD is different in the sense that the topics are generally just about whether or not the federal government should take a particular action, and the affirmatives basically will choose one action under the umbrella of the resolution, and that's their plan, their affirmative, and then the negative just debates back about whether or not that affirmative, that plan, is a good idea.
How's that transition happen for high school students to college? In that different type and the different timings and stuff like that in your experience.
Yeah, so a lot of kids who are doing value LD, I think that it can be a little challenging at first because, as one student who I just spoke to actually a second ago said, it's like learning a different language, and it is.
Okay.
Because in terms of the language and the jargon, it's a lot
Wow.
more similar to high school policy debate. We're talking plans, disadvantages, counter plans,
Mhm.
critiques, competition, conditionality, right? There's a,
Right, right, right.
a jargon, a language associated with, the decades of history behind policy debate that NFALD kind of borrows from and uses to sort of like create the foundation for our event. That if you were only exposed to, say, value LD, maybe you didn't totally have a grasp of.
Okay.
But I think that what NFALD is really good about is condensing the concepts of policy debate into shorter speech times. So
Okay.
there's an upper limit on how complex those debates can get. And so, the intent behind it, and then we're going to talk about the history, but the intent behind it was for it to be an easier transition into policy debate education for students who didn't have training in high school in policy debate.
Do you see a lot of high school policy debaters just transitioning into NFA LD, or is it like LD debaters from high school?
So I think it depends on your circuit. So
Okay.
where I am, which is kind of like the Midwest circuit, yeah, there's a lot of policy debaters
Mm,
who do NFALD. So there's kind of like a cluster of schools in NFALD in sort of like the Midwest, Kansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Texas. That's not really all the Midwest, but like you kind of that geographic center of the country in a
yeah.
way. And a lot of those teams are sort of like made up by
Mm,
a lot of former policy debaters. And I mean, if you kind of like get into sort of like geography and demographics, it makes sense because those are the areas of the country where you would have the most students who are doing policy debate, who are from public schools, or who are going to go to schools that aren't doing APDA debate or Parley.
yeah.
They're going to go to those Midwest schools. So it makes sense that a lot of those schools would have policy debate. But we've gone to tournaments in other regions. For instance, we go to tournaments in California, um, or on the West Coast. I think there's a much greater diversity of the background of the students because then you involve the community college circuit,
Right.
and then a lot of the students that are at the 4-year institutions are from that 2-year circuit. So you have a lot of novice debaters on those circuits who pick up debate in college, and that exists too in the Midwest as well, and on our team. But I think it can definitely depend on your circuit. But NFA LD is definitely a huge melting pot in terms of what background the students came from.
Hmm.
When I think back to last year's nationals, we had students that did, your traditional value LD in high school that made it very far at nationals. We had students who did policy debate who made it far. We had students who, were true novices as freshmen and were able to make it to, I believe, the semifinals
Oh, wow.
at the national tournament, so top four, where they didn't do any debate in high school at all. So yeah, there's definitely room for students who are from a variety of backgrounds to do NFA LD.
Uh, so some of the rules that are similar and different you were touching upon. One of the things that I notice is if you add up all the times, I think I'm right about this, that the affirmative actually has a little bit more time to speak overall than the
Yep.
negative. Is there a
And
reason for that?
and I think it may be the only debate event that I found that just like has a straight up distribution of time that's not
Yeah.
given. So the reason for that is if you kind of talk inside baseball to high school LDers, one of the main complaints they have is that the neg win rate, especially in the 90s and 2000s when NFLE was created, the neg win rate was super high because
Uh,
that 4 minute second affirmative speech had to answer a 7 minute negative speech, and then the negative got a second speech that was 6 minutes, and then the third affirmative speech was only 3 minutes. And so the negative had fewer speeches, but their speeches were greater in length. And there was kind of a sense that it was really challenging to answer that whole 7 minutes in 4 minutes. And so I think they were just trying to rectify that perceived problem by giving the affirmative 2 additional minutes. Um, the other thing that I would say is that when you get into, as I mentioned, the sort of like history of like argumentative diversity that exists in policy debate, and you give that to a negative in LD, it would be so hard for the affirmative to really answer the breadth of arguments that it's possible to make as the negative with that 4 minutes. So yeah, it's definitely just completely imbalanced. The F has more time.
so how do you think that's worked out? Like as far as outcomes go, do you see a different, like if neg is winning a lot in high school LD, has this evened it out? Have you seen what
Yeah.
it like
So
shows?
the studies that I've seen show either a slight AF bias or pretty close to even.
Oh, okay. Okay. So it seems like it might just having difference of time doesn't necessarily mean different of like equity as far as
Yeah.
ground and strategy and stuff like that. That's really
Mhm.
interesting. So some of the other rules that I remember being sort of interested in. One of them is the source citation one, and the reason I'm interested in that is because I remember when NFALD we're trying to make a good push out in the West, and one of
Mhm.
their initial strategies was to go after that, where if you don't have a complete source citation
Yeah.
and whatever the hell they call that, right?
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, drop that, drop them for not having the source citation. How does it happen? Okay, what the background of that, the intent of that versus how it's actually used in rounds. Do you see a distinction there?
Yeah. So I saw sort of like the things we talk about. So I did some reading on this, and I actually was able to read a couple articles by a Dr. Kevin Minch
Oh,
from Truman State University, who was on the committee that originally constructed the rules for NFALD. So NFALD started in 1991 as an experimental event at NFA,
ah,
and it kind of caught on. They liked it, and then in 1992, they basically put together some rules to sort of like permanently host the event. And the sort of like big intent that I get from Kevin Minch's work, he's written some academic articles about NFALD, and many of them touch on the history. He actually doesn't have an article that's just the whole history, which I would love to read, but he does mention it in several articles. But basically, it seems like there were two goals when they created NFALD. They wanted to create an event that was accessible to novices and to people that didn't have a ton of experience. and they wanted an event that could integrate into the culture of individual events, which
Okay.
makes sense because they were creating a debate event that was being hosted by a tournament that historically was speech only, right? So I've never read anyone directly, speaking about why they created the source citation rule, but I have my theories. So my first theory is just that they wanted the way that debaters introduce evidence to sound more like a public address event,
Oh,
or an oratory would, as opposed to the debaters rattling off, like last name, date. Like I think they
right.
wanted it to sound more,
Okay.
like an oratory than it would a debate event. But
Okay.
like every event that's ever been created, the students have some say about how the events actually manifest. And I think
Right.
as more students with experience in policy debate, or as students sort of like looked at the models and other events, saw how they were doing source citations, there became kind of like this period where it was against the rules, but everyone just did their sources the way that you would see in a policy debate round. And then at some point, someone had the fun idea to be like, well, everyone's breaking the rules. Seems like it might be an easy way to get a free win by just pointing out that they're breaking the rules. So, interesting note though is that last year, in fact, they actually got rid of that rule.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so it's the first year that there was an update, a big update to the rules in 2021
Oh,
that happened, and several of the rules that I think were sort of notorious with
right.
NFA LD were either modified or taken down.
Well, like one of the other notorious ones was speed of your speech. Was that affected by these rules changes as
It
well?
was definitely, it was changed.
Oh,
So the sort of like way that it was created originally was that it said, I think the language was, speed reading, known as spreading, or rapid fire delivery is antithetical to the purpose of the event, and judges who see it and don't point it out should get reported to the tab room and should be,
huh.
removed. It was like this really harsh rule.
Right.
I was reading one of those bench articles actually, and it said that at the first tournament, the language was something to the effect of, if you think spreading is a viable strategy in debate, do not come to our event.
Oh,
It was kind of
wow.
like that thing. But over time, like I said, students have their say, and spreading became a very prominent component of LD. So the way the rule is written now, I believe, basically sets up that you're not supposed to use speed to exclude your opponent,
Okay.
but it's not something that's like directly legislated out of the event.
Okay. Okay. You think some of the upper echelons of competition they're going pretty fast?
Yeah, so I've had people who primarily participate in college policy debate watch some LD rounds, and their kind of read on it was like it's about three-quarters as fast um,
Okay.
as your like upper end like college policy debate rounds.
Oh, wow. Okay. Um, there continuing on with some of the rules, right? There's certain uh, theory arguments that are legislated, and now I'm questioning whether or not they're still there. Specifically, what was it about topicality? All right, so like the requirement to be topical, because there are plenty of examples of people just saying that screw the topic, we're doing something else, right? So get a little background on that rule and how has it played out up until now?
Yeah, so that rule does still exist. It has pretty broad support to exist as a rule, and I think it makes sense from the perspective of an, an organization. The
Hmm.
organization puts out the topic. They say the debate should be on the topic that they put out. Um, I think that there are lots of students who um, are able to debate against the imposition of that rule and fairly successfully. I've coached a student who was able to win nationals. I'm pretty sure the first person that ever won nationals on what you might call like, like a critical laugh
Okay.
in NFA LD. And, the, the rules are interesting in the sense that having rules about theory almost goes against every instinct that you have as a judge.
Right.
Because most judges, when they watch a debate, they want the debaters themselves to negotiate the terms of the round, beyond like the basics like the speech times and,
Right.
stuff like that. So, I haven't found that there's that many judges who are persuaded by it's a rule, so you have to, lose. Those debates play out, I think, much more in terms of the students themselves negotiating that discussion.
Okay. So in extension to that, like the other theory things that are in there is like stock issues, like the affirmatives have to follow stock issues and policy.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about like critical affirmatives, how does that play out in that discussion?
Yeah, the stock issues one is interesting. So they modified that language. Stock issues is still the sort of like default paradigm,
Okay.
but judges are now encouraged or allowed to develop their own paradigms. And at least in my experience, that has never really been enforced
Okay.
by the actual judges. Judges have their own paradigms. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I think that one sort of idiosyncrasy of American debate and pretty much every manifestation is that uh, people tend to sort of like be independent thinkers. That's sort of like a facet of American culture, and so I think most debate organizations, NFA included, have found it very challenging to create rules documents that can like totally dictate the terms of the debate itself.
Right. Right. I mean, everything seems to, because policy debate has such a sort of strong center of gravity in our
Yeah.
country. Like everything seems to be influenced by it, and everything seems to circulate around it. NPDA was an offshoot of the whole policy debate, and even now, if you go to some of the higher open levels, they're blitzing out their
Yeah.
speeches, and so when I saw some final rounds for NFA LD, I'm like, I was surprised that how quickly they were speaking. So, but that kind of brings me to like, since I'm out here in the West and you're out there in Kentucky, there's a very different sort of draw to this event and participation. Like there's a dedicated but small group of people that really try to get more and more students involved with NFALD, and we've had a really difficult time getting that up and going. But so that kind of makes me wonder, do you see a breakdown regionally? Is it just Midwest and everyone else, or is there a more complicated sort of breakdown on how NFALD situates itself across the country?
So if I were to break it down, I would say that there are historically, three big circuits in NFALD.
Okay.
There's the Northeast Circuit,
Oh,
the Midwest Circuit, and then the West Coast Cali kind of circuit. Um, the Midwest Circuit, I think, is its own beast
right.
because most, if not all, of the students who are participating in NFALD, it's their only event.
Oh,
Like if you go to like most teams, like our team, Washburn, Nebraska, Lincoln, team Kentucky, Kansas, and Nebraska, the students that are on our teams, all they do all year is NFALD.
mm,
That's a huge difference from, say, on the West Coast, where those
right,
kids do parley, those kids do IPDA, speech, and
right.
LD is one component of their menu of things that they do. And so I think that it can create kind of a schism in a sense when it does kind of feel like it's the Midwest circuit versus everyone
Uh,
sometimes because for our teams, it's all we're doing all year. And so, the topics that we choose tend to be more complicated or,
yeah,
like take more time. And I think that there is sort of like a difference between how most teams, especially in the Midwest, approach doing NFALD and kind of how it was originally created. and the goal of it, like I mentioned before, was to create an event that you could do alongside your speech events.
Right.
The idea originally was you would do, extemp, impromptu, maybe a public address like info or persuasion, and then you do a little NFA LD, and it would be like one sort of like component of an overall set of things that you were doing. And then I think over time, more and more schools decided to kind of make it their sole focus. And so those schools have different needs and wants than the schools that see it as just one event and a menu of events that their students are doing.
So if you're hitting somebody from, well, first off, like, so you said the Pacific Northwest, or was that right? Or was it just, did you say, or am I getting that backwards?
So Northeast,
Northeast,
yeah.
Northeast. Yeah. So the Northeast, is there is there some sort of defining characteristic about them? Like the West has, seems to be, because it's dominated by community colleges, and
Yeah.
community colleges have, their own circuit, which stresses, maximizing the number of events that they're doing, not necessarily,
Mhm.
specializing in
Yeah.
any of them. Does the East Coast have that? The Northeast?
So I think first the Northeast circuit has declined quite a bit
Oh, really?
over time, and I think a big part of that is IPDA, which is
Oh,
another whole event.
right.
IPDA, I think, has kind of taken the place that was originally thought of as an FALD as, okay, if you're hosting a speech tournament and you want to have a debate event alongside your speech tournament, the one that most teams would do now would probably be IPDA.
Right.
And so in the Northeast, it was known as more of like a traditional circuit. A lot of those schools were doing, LD kind of like it was originally intended.
Okay.
More emphasis on communication. But there were definitely some powerhouse schools in the Northeast that some of them have done it very recently. Hope they come back, but
Who would
like
you, which names pop to mind as some of those powerhouses?
Lafayette College
Mm,
with John Boyer was a powerhouse. They had a team in the top 4 this year.
wow.
That was really really good. But John retired,
Mm,
and so I don't know if they're going to continue with LD. Hillsdale College used to have in Michigan used to have
okay.
a ton of teams that would do LD. I think they just got a new coach who was more of a parlay person, so
Uh,
they're doing parlay now. St. Anselm's College used to do LD. They do IPDA now.
okay.
There's a ton of schools, and most of them still have debate teams. I think that they've just moved to different events.
Yeah. So, and it's kind of like the schism that happened in like the late '90s with CETA debate,
Yeah.
cross examination debate, and Parley.
Yep.
So NPDA got huge,
Mhm.
and it's also having trouble with membership and participation and things like that, and specifically because IPDA is
Yeah.
influencing that as well. Does the West Coast have any like power? Like, do you expect to see certain teams at NFA from the West Coast do well in LD?
Yeah. So, the University of Pacific immediately comes
Ah,
to mind. They always bring some teams out. Sacramento State University also
oh,
comes to
cool.
mind. This isn't California, but Lewis and Clark College
Okay,
is always
fair
been
enough.
a powerhouse. They won NFALD uh,
Really?
2 years ago, I believe.
Now,
So very
is there
recent.
like a style that like you like? Okay, we're hitting a team from out west. This is what to expect from them. Do you have like advice that you give your students?
Yeah. So if we were hitting either a team or debating in front of a judge that was coming from the West Coast, my
Hmm.
main advice would just be to recalibrate how my students sort of treated analytic arguments. Because if
Oh,
you have training in parliamentary debate, your brain doesn't automatically hear an argument that isn't presented without evidence and go, well, that's not as credible, right?
hmm.
So we put more emphasis on analytics. We put more emphasis on like making arguments that don't necessarily come from evidence. But the schools that I mentioned, in particular, Lewis and Clark and Sacramento State, they pretty routinely go to a lot of LD tournaments. in the Midwest. So, there's a lot of exposure that we get with those schools.
Okay. Well, this was great. I think this is a great overview of LD in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next time that we get together, I want to talk about this season's topic and like how it was decided upon, and the process on how they do it every year. Okay,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
excellent. Hey, Chad, thank you so much for doing this. I look forward to seeing you next time. All right.
Yeah, I'll see you next time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.